If you're a business person going to work for a hardware technology company, you're going to be bombarded with acronyms and terms that are totally new to you. Even if you're an engineer that's new to hardware, there's going to be a lot of new things to learn, and it can be one of the most challenging aspects of starting a new position with a hardware company. So in today's video, we're going to decode some of those terms, particularly the ones around the hardware manufacturing process, so that you'll be prepared going into your next planning meeting. Let's get into it. So let's start at the beginning, when new technology concepts are just being validated or proven out. Sometimes this isn't even being done by the product team. It might be done by a totally separate R&D group. But this is what we would typically call the prototype phase. Sometimes these might not even look like the final product, and they're generally going to be pretty small quantities that are being built to just test out new concepts and see if an idea really is valid at all to proceed to the product development phase. These might only be built in like quantities of 10 to 20, and they're going to look really rough. Maybe just 3D printed plastics for rapid prototyping, nothing that's really finished or final looking at all. One of the common terms that you might hear at this phase is MVP, or minimum viable product. And that basically just means the minimum level of development necessary to come up with something that you can use to either prove out a concept or go validate the idea with some potential customers. So depending on the company, you might have a couple of different phases of prototyping, and it might go on for a long time if it's a really new R&D concept. But we're gonna keep it pretty simple for now and move on to the next phase, which is product definition. Okay, so your technology's been proven out and you're ready to build an actual product. So the first step in that process is defining all of the product requirements. And that goes into something that is typically called a PRD, or Product Requirements Document. This is the document that's going to describe everything that the product needs to do, all of the requirements that must be met, any regulatory considerations that must be accounted for, and everything functionally that the product needs to do. It should answer all the questions that engineering is going to need to know in order to actually start developing the product. And it represents all of the features and objectives that marketing and product development require for the product. So the PRD is done and the rubber's hitting the road. Engineering's starting to build the product, and we're headed into our first validation phase, which is called EVT, Engineering Validation Test. This involves building a small number of units, probably in the hundreds, maybe even the tens, depending on the product. And they're not going to look very pretty. We're not using any sort of finished plastics at this phase. Any sort of exterior of the product is going to be something that we call soft tooled, which means it's plastics that are designed to just be made in a small quantity that doesn't necessarily have the fit and finish of a final production enclosure. But really the purpose at this phase is to make sure that everything is fundamentally working in the product. All of the PCBs, which stands for printed circuit board, which are something like this that has all of the components on it, are going to be connected together, electrically tested to make sure that they work. All of the basic functionality of the product should come together and work at this phase. Now, usually it doesn't work the first time. You might need to make new versions of PCBs. You might need to change components. And that's what this phase is about, is understanding all of those interplays between components, but making sure ultimately that everything is working. It's not uncommon to have a couple of different stages of EVT as all of this is being worked through. So next up is a really important phase called Design Validation Testing, or DVT. For this phase, you're going to see a much larger quantity of units built, typically in the thousands, but definitely the hundreds depending on the product. At DVT, everything's going to look much more like a finished product. Cosmetics might not be perfect, but everything needs to fit together mechanically, and that's because at this phase, mechanical validation will typically occur. So things like drop testing or shock or environmental testing are going to be conducted at DVT. Any electrical issues or PCB design issues should be resolved at this phase. And normally any software or firmware that run on the device is also locked down at the end of DVT. Depending on the device, there might be regulatory approvals needed for radio emissions from different countries, governments, and so those sometimes are conducted using DVT units. Okay, so now the finish line is in sight and we're entering the PVT phase, or Production Validation Test. Everything as far as the design should be worked out at this point and locked down, and we're going to build a sample of units on the actual production line at the mass production factory. And so this is done in order to work out any potential kinks on the mass production line or supply chain issues. And so that all gets resolved during the PVT phase. At this point, nothing really should be changing as far as the product itself, or you've got a problem. Okay, it's the moment you've all been waiting for, mass production, or MP. Some companies also call this RTS, or release to ship. And this is normally preceded by a phase that's called production ramp, where factories are going to build up a quantity of units to fill in the supply chains, so then they can ship out to customers without any issues. So this, as an engineer or a product manager, is the most exciting time, of course, because your product that you've been spending all of your energy on is starting to go out into the world and be used. And it will continue to ship in mass production all the way up through EOL, or end of life, where it will be replaced by a new version. So that's a quick overview. Hopefully that helped to decode some of the mystery around hardware production terms. Keep in mind that these aren't necessarily industry conventions, even though they're pretty common. Some companies might use slightly different meanings or even different acronyms, but they usually basically mean about the same thing. And it's good to have a heads up, even if you have to do some translation. So thanks again for joining. Hopefully this was helpful to you. If it was, please like and subscribe. And as always, let me know in the comments if there's something else you'd like me to cover. If you have any questions about any of this, I'd love to hear from you. And we'll see you next time.